in the format for this, because we really want interaction, I will go through these topics and talk through a bit. We're not going to have any exhaustive walkthrough of the spec proposal because that would be very boring. So I hope that everyone who wants to comment on it has read it, or at least spent some time with it. So I'll talk about the MNX status very briefly. We're going to have an important discussion about the overall roadmap for the work of the group, because MNX has more than one facet and CWMN is one facet. I want to talk about interoperability, CSS, some of the sort of main structural features in MNX that might have some interesting discussion around them, and next steps for the group. And then I want to return to the question of sort of how do we deal with a more generalized approach to notation. Yeah, so those are the topics. And in between, as I progress through this, I'm going to stop and solicit feedback and sort of pause for discussion and back and forth. So we'll see how that format works. So a couple of inspirational quotes. Maybe they just work for me. And sort of a reminder for all of us. Anytime you make one of these things, it's expensive and difficult, so should we really do it? I hope so, but we'll find out. Okay, so just the status quickly of MNX as it stands now. It's really a rough overview with a lot of gaps. It needs a tremendous amount of work, and my goal for the document that's out there now is just to give everyone a picture of a concrete direction that I hope will be useful to the whole music software ecosystem.
One question, is it possible to lower the basses in the amplifier?
Oh, maybe I can just get a little further back. Does that help?
That's nice.
Okay, great. Thanks for the feedback.
Yeah.
Yep. I'll speak up and be further. So we've got this rough overview. It's not a spec. The spec will take a different form that will be much more rigorous, but I thought it would be best to get something out in front of the community as early as possible. So that's why it's in the format it's in. There's a very few examples, far fewer than I would like, but maybe it's best to sort of get some airing of people's thinking before really diving in on that. Had a lot of good food for thought. A lot of great issues have come up on the list. So I'm sure they'll come up here too. So let me talk a little bit about the roadmap. And this is the section where I'll go beyond conventional Western music notation for a bit, because I think it's very important to give the group a sense of the picture that we foresee going forward that's bigger than the initiative that you see in front of you now. So, I believe that there's a general trade-off between three desirable qualities in specs. And I think that this is not specific to music. This is a kind of summary of a bunch of hard-won lessons from building software. You can have a really strong model, semantics, that describes some shared understandings in the world, and that's a nice thing. You can have interoperability, which means you've got the ability in the ecosystem to build a lot of applications that will work together because there is a practical set of concepts to implement. Practical meaning small and clear. And generality, meaning expressiveness, the ability to cover a lot of ground, to describe a lot of things in the world. When we talk about markup languages or encodings, we want to encode more things rather than fewer. That's what a lot of the discussion right now is centering around. So my view is you can't really have all three of these. You can have really strong semantics and interop, but the trade-off for that is you're probably going to have to be less general in what you cover as the price of interoperability, because if you have strong semantics and a very, very rich vocabulary, you're going to have a very, very large, unwieldy specification. That's the top of the triangle. At the left, if you have really strong semantics and a lot of, that's the case I just described. Strong semantics, lots of generality, really big vocabulary, big implementation surface, as developers like to say, what's the surface area I have to cover to comply with the spec? That surface gets really big. So you get way fewer people able to participate, and you get much less certainty that your encoding works as it goes from one app to another app to another app. And on the bottom right hand, if you want a lot of generality and a lot of interoperability, I believe you need to ratchet back on the semantics and have a pretty general way of describing your subject matter, music notation in this case, where you try not to model as much and you let more things speak for themselves. I know I'm being vague, but I will come back to this point. So, where do specs kind of stack up in this triangle? I think that MusicXML has sort of occupied a middle ground in terms of like generality versus semantic strength, clarity. And where we're trying to go with the CWMN part of MNX is to really strengthen the semantics and strengthen the interoperability by narrowing it and being very focused on sort of what do we want to represent? What are the cases where we're going to have a notion of compliance this time that's pretty strong. You'll be able to tell if your implementation is really consuming and emitting valid MNX, and the trade-off for that is we're going to constrain it so that it's clearer what's allowed and what's not. There is also another facet of MNX that I'll talk about. I'm calling it graphics plus time for the time being. We really need a better nomenclature for these dialects, so forgive me, it's not baked and it's maybe not very clear. That will be the very general version, but not so good semantics. And I want to point out that we already have a family of specifications, really a framework for building many specifications called MEI, the Music Encoding Initiative. I encourage everyone to check it out if they haven't already. And MEI is really a wonderful toolkit for kind of taking a very wide palette of encoding tools and kind of crafting the mix that works well for your project. It's used very widely in scholarship, and that I see as sort of another extremum of this triangle. So, moving from this view of trade-offs, here's what I think the roadmap should look like for this group. At the moment, the now era, we're looking at a way of encoding notation that assumes, I'll call it idiomatic CWMN, right? Music notation that is pretty well in conformance with the median of what you see between 1600 and 1900. And it certainly excludes many works, but it covers a lot, and it's an eminently implementable subset of all the possible things that can be in notation. So it's intended to be a practical and much narrower solution than MusicXML. But by no means a disappointing one. I think it will cover most of the repertoire that today actually is encoded in MusicXML in a de facto sense. And as a corollary to that, I think in front of the group is the task of thinking about a far more general approach to representing notation, and one that I think ought to fulfill its goals, allow pretty much any graphical representation of music at all that has time as an element of it be encompassed. And I think that's going to entail allowing the graphics to really represent themselves in many ways, and so that we don't get embroiled in many insoluble puzzles about how a particular approach to notating music, of which there's really an infinite number, ought to be represented in terms of specific elements that represent ideas for that kind of notation. I think we need to, in this realm, start to allow works to speak more for themselves and encode them according to their needs as they conceive of graphics and time. And I really see this as a longer range project, which is why I'm not bringing any examples or proposals yet to the table. I want to study, and I think we should all study, the precedents for this, because there are precedents. People have attempted to unify graphics and time in general ways. I'll mention SMIL, Synchronized Multimedia Integration Language, is one such example. There's a lot to look at, and I want to come back to this question, not to abandon it, but just to let it unfold in a more thoughtful and longer-term way. So, a lot of the recent lengthy discussions on the list, I think, revolve around the fact that we have this middle ground of notation that includes facets of CWMN. I call it CWMN inspired because it really does go outside the boundaries of what we think of as idiomatic CWMN. And I think of Alex posted an example from Ligeti's Musica Riccata. That's kind of right on the edge. Maybe it's a little past the edge. But you certainly can go much further into many notations that incorporate CWMN elements in non-standard ways, or mix them with other invented elements that don't really correspond to anything you would find in traditional notation. So what do we do with those things? And I think the dilemma or decision facing the group is, do we try to shoehorn that stuff into the same tool set we use for idiomatic CWMN, or do we take it to the lower of these two categories that I was describing, and say, well, let's treat this as really as we would extreme non-Western notation of, maybe it's coming from a completely different culture, maybe it's squiggles on a page. We don't care. I think it has to go this way. If we're going to keep interoperability and not descend into sort of an endless vortex of constantly building out semantics further and further and further to accommodate more and more ideas of what notation could mean. Now, this doesn't mean that that's not a valid thing to do. It just means I think this is probably not the right place to do it, because we're focused on interoperability. We want encodings to be things that a program can show to a person, can perform to a user, where there's some relationship that can be drawn between what they see and what they hear. So that's the reason I feel the way I do about this.
Question?
And I think we are pretty much at the end of this roadmap piece, so it's actually a perfect point to take questions. Thank you.
Yes. I would like to know, where do we see in this approach music, for example, that has not been written between 1600 and 1900, but in its way it's not graphical, like medieval music, which is written before 1600. Because I only see two ways here. I see the way of writing common Western music notation and graphical music, but there are different kinds of music which fit into these two approaches.
Great question. And I think that, well, in my quest to simplify this diagram, I talked about two approaches. I think that because MNX permits multiple content types, the way is open, and I expect us to follow it, to develop other idiomatic encodings that are not for CWMN. And they may draw on CWMN concepts or leave them further open. And for instance, if you look at the example of MEI with neumes and mensural notation, and I know MusicXML incorporates some support for that also. So yes, I do expect that for other non-CMN dialects that possess a shared understanding in the world, that's key, we can have idiomatic semantic representations that are kind of analogous to the CMN one.
And I think there's great potential as well to do this within the MNX family so that we're sharing concepts between the repertoires as appropriate. We're not trying to shove everything together, but to take the commonalities between different repertoires and make that explicit as commonalities and let the differences be the differences. When we did MusicXML and people said, why don't you do medieval music? I would say, use NormsXML, use CMME, but those don't have the same concepts of MusicXML. That's not as good a solution as being able to do things in a common family of notations, I don't think.
Yeah, I want to recognize Alex because he had his hand up.
Can you give an example of countries outside CWMN?
Gosh, I mean, I was looking at a Barrio score this morning that had like lots of, it had some notes in it, and it had a bunch of invented symbols too that were unique to that piece, that had some semantics specific to that piece.
John Cage.
John Cage would be great. Aleatoric music where the performance might be probabilistically determined according to chance, based in some way on what you're looking at, or where the performer has great freedom to play or not play various notes. Those would be some examples. I welcome more examples from the group if people would like to suggest them. I think there's lots. I mean, there's the 20th and 21st centuries are full of amazing, inventive stuff that is hard to anticipate. Thankfully, that's what makes it so good. Alex.
Thank you, Joe. I assume that there will be a later part where we can have a more general discussion, so I would just like a few questions I had to this.
But this is a good point to talk about the roadmap if you do have comments on the roadmap.
It's a more general problem. Could you go back one slide? No, that's not the right one. Could you go forward one slide? This one, thank you. Your top row, where you state the idiomatic CWMN. Do you have a hard definition for that? Can you tell me, you said some pieces go outside the boundaries of what you call idiomatic CWMN. Can you show me those boundaries for any piece?
Well, I think we're going to have to decide them. I haven't put them out there yet, but I think the examples that we've provided are suggestive of them, but certainly not a good working definition.
How do you decide those boundaries if you just said yourself that these pieces that you imagine, they are not, what was the term you used, you can't anticipate them, or something to that?
Oh, I wasn't talking about idiomatic CWMN.
I know, but how do you, I mean, we have to have a boundary, you said that, between what you call idiomatic CWMN and everything else.
Yeah.
So how do you, with a hard definition, how do you make that cut? If you say yourself that everything else can be anything.
Well, it's a slippery slope kind of problem, but the solution to it is really one of process and not of sort of absolute philosophy. You know, that we're going to propose. Multiple people can propose a boundary, and we will decide in the group what the boundary is.
So this boundary would be one of consensus.
Well, the charter of the group is not exactly consensus. It says we hope for consensus, we seek consensus, and then we'll make a decision.
Can it be defined, or must it be decided?
I think we need to decide it.
How in the world are you going to do that? But okay,
How are we going to do that?
how are you going to do that?
How are we going to do that?
I just heard it's not completely based on consensus.
Well, that's because someone at the end needs to call, needs to sort of say, okay, here's where we wind up. And we won't achieve complete agreement.
I wouldn't like to be in the shoes of the guys who have to make the final call.
It is dangerous that somebody could show up at my door, you know.
As I said, I just want to get out a few questions right now because I think it's a better place to talk about it deeper and later. Just one thought that if your lower line, that's something that I thought on the mailing list. There has been a lot of discussion lately about the contrast of the idiomatic CWN and graphic notation.
Mm-hmm.
And you yourself wrote that you would propose that we look at that at a later time, but in a more generalized way. And I was thinking if that is really the right focus for these other things, because as interesting as that is, couldn't it be more interesting, for example, to look at some more obscure notations? Someone posted something about, I don't know what was the Okinawan.
Okinawan, yeah.
Just instead to take the most undefinable thing, which is graphics, and to look at other more smaller things.
I think those are good test cases too. They have to be accommodated in this other arm of MNX.
Because
everything does, really. Even CWMN. We're going to come back to the whole graphic notation thing later at the end, and I wonder if, I know some other people have their hands up, so I wonder if we can return to this, not to set aside the discussion. James, I saw you.
Yeah, I rather agree with that. I think that it's a mistake to think that common Western music notation suddenly stopped developing. It stopped around 1970, but I think that it will probably start developing again. I think it was a way to move forward without, I think there are more general forms of CWN which one can develop without drawing them up. And so I don't think that I still haven't understood what you mean by graphic notations. And I'd just like to say that I think all music notations contain event symbols. Event symbols have graphics and they have a temporal meaning. And that's true of all music notations that are interesting. All Japanese, doesn't matter which direction you're reading. It's also important in CWMN, which also has well-defined and very effective event symbols. And I think that they've developed over centuries, and they're very efficient, you know, and they're very legible. And I think we should build on that and not suddenly say that this tradition has come to an end.
I agree that evolution continues, and I think that my view on it is that in some time from now, we will be able to identify the shared understandings that have emerged from that latter-day evolution of Western music, and address them with encodings that convey their spirit and their meaning. But I think that it is that shared understanding that we need in order to fulfill that goal, so that we don't have a sort of gigantic semantic fishing expedition. I know you don't like the word semantics, but I can't seem to quite escape that idea for me.
Can I just answer that? I think that the common Western music notation has developed to be extremely legible, and it's been trial and error for hundreds of years, and it has become extremely efficient. And I think it would be a mistake to think that we have to forget all that tradition and build something else.
Mm-hmm. Well,
so it needs developing, and for me as a composer, I can remember very well feeling how stupid it is that you can only put symbols in particular places. Why can't you put symbols between symbols? So that's where I would like to generalize common Western notation rather
Mhm.
than develop something on the side.
Okay. Any other comments on James' points? Anyone else's points, the roadmap? Does this make sense, this overall framework?
Yeah, one
right
question. Roadmap. Since on the list you allude to that the other part will be done later, is there something
I think we'll finish it later.
finished later? Is there something that comes with that allusions? Is there something like vague timetable for this?
I think we should try to have one, and we should have that along with the roadmap document. We should just take a stab. We should have goals.
Because
I think it makes sense. to
I
have
don't
goals.
want to sound too paranoid, but sometimes I read this and it sounds a bit like, let's do this first. Yes, of course we will do the other stuff later.
Yeah.
We will come to that.
I know.
Let's do this first.
It does sound like it, and also I feel sometimes when I say, I really, really care, it's, well, how do you know? I do care, but we should have a timetable too, so. It's
Let me tell you, I would feel very reassured with something like timetable.
Okay. It's a completely
Or
reasonable.
more reassured.
More sure, okay. Any other thoughts, comments? Yes?
Don't set up unnecessary limits. There's no idea in setting a limit just because you say, oh, are you Western? Or then
Right.
should do something to avoid you to use this. If this notation is okay for a non-Western person,
Right,
why shouldn't he use it?
I agree.
Yeah.
Now, that's the concept of the family of notation, the family
Right.
of profiles.
Just as with neumes or mensural notation, there's room for someone to take Okinawan notation or whatever it is and develop a module that addresses the particular concerns of that family of notation and add that to the mix. And then, of course, it's up to application developers to decide whether they'll do it or not. But
Could I just say something? I had a private correspondence with Mark who was doing the Okinawan notation, and he said, I advised him to answer the questions I asked on the list. I think it was very simple questions, and advised him not to jump the gun, but to find out the answers and take his time and answer in good time when he got the answers, because that's when we will know how to incorporate it into what I think was emanates. So don't think that he's just disappeared. He's coming back.
good. Is this about the roadmap?
Yes.
Okay.
In a way. I hope. And just for context, this question is not to be meant contentional. It's just really just.
Contention's okay.
Yeah, but it is not meant in this case, by the way. You said we are focused on interoperability.
Yeah.
Could I ask, because I missed that, who settled that? What we are focused on?
That was part of the focus.
The use
of-
cases.
of- It's also the community group
Because I
charter.
remember the use cases.
It's the community group charter about the building
Yeah, that's
of
true. It is in the
applications that
charter.
are shared. This is from the chartering of
The
the
charter
group.
is
The-
for the use cases?
Yes,
For the group.
the charter was at the very beginning of
Okay.
43.
Interoperability is a bad thing. I'm an amateur coder, so I'm not even really sure what interoperability is. I'm just
The
trying to
focus,
get.
the focus in this group is for application development and interoperability. That is the focus of the
So
community
that
group.
focus of interoperability, it was at the start of the whole thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
And there are other groups that approach music encoding and don't care about interoperability.
Yeah. NEI.
MEI being I shouldn't say they don't care. There are
not-
there are
it's not
projects
the
within
focus.
MEI that care a
It's
lot
not the
about it.
focus of the-
And but it's not the overall part of the basis of the initiative in the city. Yes?
Yeah, I want to appreciate that. I really think it's correct to focus, because I feel like everybody's trying to widen this focus, but as Joe said, I really think if you think about how it's going to be adopted, and that's key, it has to be adopted, otherwise we're really losing time, I guess. So I'm really at the point that I think, please focus. We might not catch everything, we probably won't. We won't actually. I think it's impossible to catch everything. But if the focus is there, then it can start, and from there develop more profiles and widen it after it gets adopted, because otherwise it won't be adopted and there won't be anything. I fear.
Yes.
So I really think keep the focus. That's
Thanks. Thanks.
I would like to second that argument. For the experience we have with MUI, where we more or less have this infrastructure that you just described, with profiles and different things. It's much easier to start with a small subset and add additional features when they are needed, and there is a consensus that they are needed by a larger group, than taking out things afterwards that you don't need, but someone says, oh, I still need that and it's important for me. Just start with something simple, have an agreement on that, and then if there is really a need, there's substantial need, include it later on. I think that's much more sensible and helpful, and will bring you much farther than the opposite way. So don't put everything under one hat, it won't work. That's the experience from MEI that we can offer to share with them.
Thank you, Johannes. That's great. Yes?
And also, I think if there's other materials to be developed, well, I would be surprised. I would strongly encourage to look at MEI for that, because if somebody wants to develop a new module for MusikMesse, maybe it would be interesting to look at what's done there in MEI, because it already exists there, and it's a niche. So making a second niche of that niche.
Yeah. I think they're both, I think that it is fruitful to look at both worlds as they evolve, and sort of, there's good choices all around. So that's Laurent, the creator of Verovia.
First, I want to ask you to tell all your names. We have a list, but we know a lot of people, but your names and what you are standing for.
Hello, Fischer, and I'm involved in the MEI community.
Okay. Christoph Schad, Primus Music Notation Editor. I would strongly encourage and second your thoughts about, from viewpoint of an implementer. Getting things done in this area is far from trivial. It takes your life. You will notice if you start to do it. And every music notation problem just exists because of all these limits that you painfully accept and learn over decades of years. And that's not different from the specification. We saw Michael starting 20 years almost ago, and now we have something usable with things that we learned. You have your impressible lessons learned from this conference talk, where you can read all this, what is linked with such a project. So in order to make MNX a success, we should agree upon this stage, upon first coping with Western music and all this. This will be enough, and then being flexible enough to go to other areas. But I see in the group, in the discussion group, that most people which are maybe reading don't raise their voice. It's just these people who have concerns and who have the ability to slow down this process in discussing philosophical aspects of time and space and sound. This does not bring us the practical steps that we need to get this thing done. So I encourage exactly this first level of doing, and I have read this thoroughly and think this is a very, very trustful beginning. And you see that we have in Joe and in the team and all somebody you can trust in this idea and can trust to meet decisions which are good for the process. So I have no problems with Joe setting the limits.
Am I dictator for life yet?
Can I help?
Yes.
My name is Alon. I'm CEO of Control Music, and I want to say that I feel that this group's responsibility kind of minimized the amount of symbols. I mean, you were talking about 3,000 symbols. I think by the time someone learns 100 of them, it takes like 8 to 12 years, right? I mean, there's so many symbols because there are different symbols for different instruments, and I think this is in response to, I don't know your name, I'm sorry, but you said, why can't I put this symbol here and not there? I think it's our responsibility to standardize it. Because when the first word processors came out, I mean, people were writing language in a lot of curious ways, and they had all these strange symbols, and I had a chance to talk to some CTOs from great companies that should be here, and there's always an outliner. In every piece of classical music, there's an outliner, and I believe that we need to kind of focus it and get rid of a lot of symbols if we can, and standardize where we put every symbol, like has been done for the last 15 to 20 years, I guess, with your work.
I'm going to take one more comment because I want to make sure we cover more ground, and this discussion is not over. This is the beginning, so we'll continue on the list with this. Alex? Oh, I'm sorry, you were pointing to someone?
I just want to give actually a rebuttal there. Daniel, am I on?
What do you mean?
No, I'm not sure if I'm...
I wasn't sure if someone else was...
Okay.
Adrian had a contribution.
Let's give Adrian a chance to speak since he hasn't actually...
Pressure's on. Since we established that the charter is about interoperability, I'm wondering if we can use, to answer your question of who decides the boundaries, what if we just did a survey of the top 30 notation programs that already exist and just say, okay, Sibelius supports these however many things, this supports this supports this, and that will give us sort of a scientific answer of these are the boundaries. Because if we're about I can't even say the word, then it's sort of, there's this chicken and egg problem. The programs won't support things if it's not in the spec, but if we're really about interop, maybe we start there and we just do a catalog of this is everything that is possible by these top apps. And maybe that's at least a starting point.
It's an interesting idea. We should think about it. All right, I think we need to keep this rolling. Save your thought, Alex. So let me whip through this. So I'm going to shift into CWMN here a little bit. We're going to come back to the sort of general notation question. Why are we doing CWMN again? I think it's important to say this. We want strong interop for an expanded set of use cases that's bigger than it was when MusicXML started. We want to let developers build simple and small apps with a minimum of effort. So I foresee a future where you get an MX library, you do a little bit of simple programming or scripting on top of that, and you've got an app that manipulates, that lets people work interactively with music notation for whatever purpose. Not a full-blown editor, but there's a lot that people want to do besides build notation editors. We want to standardize on an agreed subset so that this thing is interoperable and that people know how to build it and work with it. We want to cleanly separate semantics, appearance, and interpretation. We want the structure in the schema to do a good job of constraining content so that it's hard to create invalid stuff. We want more clarity and terseness. good container elements, ease of parsing, one pass through, we hope. And not least, we want to leverage the mindshare that MusicXML has in this community and build on that. So in a way, MNX is only partly another CWMN encoding. We hope that it's really sort of the inheritor. If MusicXML was going to have a 4, this would kind of be it. So I don't think of this as completely separate from MusicXML. What does it mean to really have interop? So MNX has a few things, some of which I've talked about, some of which I haven't. It has profiles and content types, and these are mechanisms so that we don't get into an endless cycle of, but I want to do X. Well, we're going to have a standard profile even within CWMN. That is, CWMN features that are part of the sort of core so that application developers can say, I support MNX core. And we know it, and we'll all know what that means. There will be CWMN features that are idiomatic, but that maybe are outside that standard profile. Very abstruse things that are hanging around in the MusicML spec or some of the glyphs, in Smoofle, like. So there will be profiles that we hope will help constrain these things. They'll also constrain usage in some way. So we'll have some notion of, what is a well-formed standard profile score. I'm not going to pretend to know exactly what those are. I put some initial stabs at them in the proposal that I'm sure there's something in there to displease everybody, but that'll be one of the things that we have to decide. Do we support polymeter or not? Do we allow, parts with dissimilar numbers of measures, dissimilar lengths, etc. A thing that I have not talked about much, but I think is going to be important, is we're going to, in the presentation aspect of MNX, we need to have a rendering model that sort of tells us, is this being rendered according to some baseline set of expectations? I've done really no work on this, and I think it's still a problem in front of us. What does it mean for a rendering to actually be conformant? And this was something that actually L. Peter Deutsch brought up a long time ago on the MusicXML list.
Christophus.
Yeah, so, we also need to nail down how glyphs line up and lots of things. We need to know what it means to do this right, and yet, the notion of right needs to be loose enough that there's room for all the different applications to kind of do their special thing in terms of what they think constitutes good layout. So these aren't going to be, X, Y position type prescriptions. They're going to be constraints of some kind, I think.
This is the type of documentation issue I was referring to, and things that I don't want to address in MusicXML 3.1. I want to address them in the context of MNX.
Yeah, and browsers have this sort of stuff too. Like there's a sort of a CSS rendering model. It doesn't say everything about what a browser has to do because the browser vendors wouldn't like that. It does say certain things that they must do, but there's lots of room for things that they may do when they want to. All right, let's move on to talking about CSS, which is certainly one of the hot button aspects of this spec. And I'll be the first to say you could do this whole thing without CSS, but I think it would be more painful than doing it with it. That's just my thesis. And I wanted to take the more aggressive position on CSS because I think it's important to have this discussion and see where it goes and validate whether it's a good tool for the job or not. So there's been a fair amount of misunderstanding about the CSS in MNX. It's not there because CSS is a webby technology, although it is. It's there because I think it's a very nice way to have a rule-based system that applies notions of appearance or interpretation, which I'll broadly call just styling, to aspects of a markup language in a way that is orthogonal to the structure of the markup language. So you can have in CSS a way of saying, all the elements of type such and such, here's a prescription for how they look. Or, so that might apply to notes, or it might apply only to grace notes. or it might apply only to notes that have been marked as to be emphasized somehow, and you can separately say, all the elements that have been identified in such and such a way have these properties. You can also, in an ad hoc way, inside the markup, for one specific element, just say, this one element looks just like the following. And that's kind of analogous to MusicXML's existing attributes that let you do things like fine-tune X and Y and offsets and whatnot. And there are parsing libraries available for CSS, and so it's not, I feel it's not rocket science to include it, but I'm going to get onto the not so good in a minute. I've got the other side of the equation. Another sort of get out in front type idea in MNX is the idea of using styles not just for appearance, which is what CSS was originally designed for, but for interpretation. And the idea here is, the notion of rendering music has a visual facet and it has an auditory facet, or performance facet. And so I wanted to take the position that CSS actually can be used to style the performance of semantic markup. So this allows CSS to take the place of various sound-related elements that are in MusicXML. And it even would allow us to take, this is in the proposal, inject kind of specific prescriptions for how a particular event is to be played back in a score that effectively overrides whatever the default interpretation might be. You could have a quarter note, middle C, and decide, no, I want to play that as, a trill, an arpeggio, a completely different note, or what have you. So, what are some potential problems with CSS? People clearly are not wild about having another syntax in this file that they have to parse that's more than just, a string. I mean, CSS has a structure, it needs to be parsed. I think that CSS is kind of oriented more towards the need of publishing maybe than Exchange when you look at sort of the rule-based part of it. How are we going to take, what form do rules take inside of the notation editor? I think different notation editors have very different ideas on how you style a thing in a score, and whether that style is some sort of rule or whether it's just an ad hoc property of one object. And I have my concerns that the CSS selector and rule system does not really, may not be able to capture that kind of thing. And maybe we shouldn't try. Maybe we should step away from using that particular rule selector piece of CSS in the Exchange, in the application of MNX for Exchange. Selector syntax is very open-ended. So I'm going to sort of shift to my text editor here for a second. If we go to one of these, like here's the example for a building. So in the front, we've got these sort of rule-based declarations of appearance for the score. And these can take various forms. So this is saying, all directions might have this, these following properties in terms of size and placement and so forth. But then maybe a tempo indication has a different set of properties that override the defaults. That's a very powerful and nice thing to do, and yet, is that something that applications would actually export, or importing it is probably easier than exporting it? I don't know. I think, yeah, so there's a lot of room for debate on how rich should be the use of these sort of rule-based selectors in CSS. Where I do think, though, they maybe shine a little more clearly is in this sort of thing. So here we've got a wedge, and this wedge element has what I call ad hoc styles. They're just style properties defined just for this element. And they only apply here. This is a little more analogous to what MusicXML offers today, but it's kind of cleanly packaged in one attribute. And if you want to ignore it, you just ignore it. You don't have to look at some big list of what are all the things that maybe I don't care about if I'm only interested in semantics. Okay, so I will leave it there on CSS and open up the discussion. Yes, yeah.
Well,
Briggs.
yes. Oh, Matt Briggs from a new app that's about to launch called Comp for iOS. As a C++ programmer, I'm not very familiar with CSS, so it is a little bit hard for me to understand the benefits. For example, when you showed your text editor, I'm looking at something that could just as easily be written in XML. I don't really understand why it's better as a CSS string. And then when you showed the example of an ad hoc style attribute, to me that looks like stringly typed data. And I would say that when we're trying to provide great interop, that's the charter. I don't think that we should say it's easy to ignore as a selling point
Okay.
on something like that.
I did, by the way, try to sort of take a look at what it might look like to not use CSS for the same stuff. So I'll just briefly throw that on the screen. So
Okay, and I haven't had a chance doing the whole show thing, but I would like to provide you with some XML examples that I just dream up to see.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Yeah, please post those to the list. And I took the liberty of Matt and I had a discussion about this earlier, and we were talking about, well, what would it take to do this as pure XML? So I kind of quickly recast some of the same data just as XML markup. It's really kind of saying the same thing, but in XML. And here's sort of the same wedge, with some sort of XML embedding of the same stuff, but inside a format tag.
And then if I could just...
I don't want to jump the gun on your ideas either,
Yeah.
so, yeah.
I just want to turn this into a question, I guess, instead of just a comment. But,
Yeah.
how do you envision the constraining of CSS? Like, what does that look like? How do you constrain the CSS content?
Constrain
So that we know what can and cannot be put in the CSS, like with the syntax that's allowed.
Do you mean the set of properties that can be used?
I
Or do you
guess.
mean the
set of
kinds of rules?
I don't know how it works. How does it work?
Okay.
How do I know what to put there? How is it specified?
Yeah, so the spec will say, for a given element,
Right.
here are all the style properties that make sense.
So there's a language like XSD for doing this for CSS.
I don't know if there's a language or not.
Okay.
I mean, it'd be nice if there were. It's kind of outside the bounds of the schema tools, as I understand it.
But it's more like a list of properties.
It's a list of properties. Like if you look at the HTML or SVG specs,
Got
they
it.
have these things. And the other thing that can be constrained is sort of the kinds of rules that are supported when you have rule-based declarations. So.
But you don't necessarily have constraints like in XSD where you say this number can be between 0 and 100.
You spec it, but it's not a schema.
It's not machine readable. Like
So it's all
XSD.
embedded in a string, is it? So it doesn't interfere with the XSD.
Correct. It doesn't interfere with the XSD.
I'll stop, but what I mean is it's not a machine readable format like XSD. For example, we can generate classes, we can generate code from XSD, but we wouldn't be able to do that with the
I should study up and ask my W3C friends about this.
Yeah.
Because actually, I know the CSS spec lead, and that person can tell me,
Cool.
like, hey, what about this?
Okay, I'm done on
It may be that there is something and I don't know about it.
Thanks.
Yeah, James.
I saw come
James
up on the
Sutton.
list, yes, sorry, I saw come up on the list something like temperament. Have you put any thought into that?
No.
Because at the moment,
It's among the many things into which no thought
equal
has
temperament,
gone.
prejudice.
Does MusicXML support temperament in some way?
Not directly, no.
I
It does it by an ad hoc You know, you can tune things to whatever temperament you want, one
Yes.
part at a time. That's not
Yeah.
temperament
No,
support.
It uses MIDI pitches,
Mhm.
so.
Without saying whether we support temperament or not, my take on it off the top of my head is it would be a good kind of interpretation style thing
Yes.
to add. At the level of the score, you would say, well, you know, here's something that affects the performance of this score, but maybe it's semantics, so I don't know.
No, I think it has to be embedded. The pitches of the notes have to be embedded. But I'm
I want to think about
But
it.
the pitches, I mean, one of the applications in the proposal for CSS is, for instance, using CSS to cover some things that MusicXML tried to do by having dual elements that nobody ever understands. and so if you know, specifying swing in a particular way for rhythmic durations, you could also specify temperament in a way that is adjusting what the nominal pitch is. The nominal pitch.
At the level of each note can be adjusted up or down.
Maybe.
Yeah, I think that is something that could fit in a similar way to examples that Joe provides about how other aspects of performance and interpretation could be done. Or maybe we want to do it a different, more straight semantic way. We don't know.
Yeah, I feel like I'll stick my foot in my mouth if I guess right now. So I don't know.
Could I say that? Yeah, I'm just wondering whether we have MNX going into an application and coming out as SVG. And I'm just wondering whether it's better to put the CSS in the SVG rather than in the MNX file.
You've got to put the CSS in the MNX so that the SVG knows how it should look.
Well, it might be
It's not the same CSS.
No, it's not the same. But I'm just brainstorming that I think the application is able to add its own CSS.
That's certainly true, yeah.
So it may be more effective to leave the CSS to the application.
But I think if we want to encode any appearance, any style, in inverted commas information, there has to be a way of doing that in MNX, which could be CSS or it could be something
And
else.
it's a very similar situation. I have this proposal for the technical definition of events. This definition can go in the SVG and it can go in the MNX. And you could do the same thing with CSS. You could move the CSS more or less one-to-one from one entity through the application. So you just pass it through.
I don't think we should, though. I don't think we should be.
Just brainstorming.
Yeah, it's possible, and I don't think, though, that we have the intention of tying MNX in the CMN dialect to any specific output format like SVG. It might go straight to a screen. We just don't know. Other CSS thoughts before we move on?
I see two different places of application. We have these local styles. Style is
like element-specific stuff.
Element-specific styles.
Yeah.
And we have these outside styles which have a great effect, a large effect.
Yes, cross-count.
In the first case, I don't know whether the alternatives of having explicit XML on this place, which would be the same on the informational way, whether this is an advantage or the one or the other. But the controlling XML as an imported file or a style tag would enable us to make variations of a score. For example, so let away for this song sheet, let away the chord symbols, or make them with or without guitar frets, or select smaller states for conductor score. Make all these variations happen with one database and just throwing different CSS as these semantic data. So I think that's really the way to go, and CSS has brought us, gives us for free the documentational, the margins and all these stylings apart from music, and we can just take it, and so this would be a step forward.
My hope would be, this is a sort of a could be, that we might have options in notation editors to export without style information and allow an external style sheet at the election of the person doing the export, to supply all the style information for a house style, and there might be multiple house styles, you want to switch between them in this way, to customize the score. And it's very common now in programming, in writing HTML with CSS, just by analogy, to not use any ad hoc styles in elements at all. Everything is always done in the style sheet so that you get a very, very clean document that has no kind of extra info in it.
We have about 15 minutes for the
Okay.
MX, rest of the MX.
All right, so
You wanna
all
move
of
on
the
to cursors?
Yeah, we may need to. All right, in the interest of covering stuff, I'm going to sort of speed up a bit. We did put in some compact syntaxes for pitch and rhythm and duration. This is a little controversial maybe because MusicXML has sort of very fine-grained structure around these things. I think that the list and this discussion are probably as good a demonstration as any that we do talk about and read and write these things by hand an awful lot. So I think there's value to that. Cursors and positioning. I think this is going to turn out to be one of the big decision points in MNX as we go ahead. There are a lot of elements, specifically directions, that can go anywhere. I wish I had made a better example for this. But, well, imagine a whole note in a measure, and you have a dynamic, and then a wedge, and another dynamic. And you really want, the composer had a notion of where those things went metrically in the bar. And as you stretch or reflow, you'd want those symbols to kind of, expand or contract so that they were still metrically aligned with the content of that bar. So, when you have directions like that, how do you place them? X and Y don't really work. And you would really like them to be anchored at some metrical position in the bar. So there are different options in front of us for how to do that. The MNX cursor concept, which is, I think, works pretty well to make events very simple to specify in the sort of non-overlapping forward advance way. Fails us here because we need to put the direction at a specific point that doesn't correspond to any event. Our whole node is one event. Where do all those other directions go? So we have a few things on the table. MusicXML used this offset concept, which said, well, wherever the cursor is, you can add this thing to it. That does work. You could have a position specification within the bar. I think that's Daniel's preferred idea. Or you could advance the cursor artificially with something that sort of the moral equivalent of the forward directive of MusicXML, or I'm not calling it that because it's not the visions anymore. So, cursors. Anybody want to say anything about this? Yeah.
I think we should avoid what is that elements, that events may take positions. We have this wonderful progress that we have now a sequence, and that elements are just put in the sequence and we know it goes forward. And now that we have positions in time, you can just do the same shit as in MusicXML. You can spell the melody backwards with forward and back. So this positional tag should be restricted to accompanying elements who are somehow linked to this timeline. And events simply give me events in the order and nothing else. So then it would make it easier for implementers, for importers to know how the line works.
Yeah, we probably need to develop some good examples on the list and
So
get people to post
I
their
think
improvements.
positions would make all this or this game we lose or what we get with sequences.
Okay.
That's one. And offset versus positions. I think we should try to decode the intention. You made this example, a whole note and the dynamics on the halfway, half the time. And if this happens at the beginning of the bar, then there's no difference between the absolute position and the relative to the whole note. If it happens somewhere, then this offset position would be intentional. It would say it is happening after the note has sounded half time. If we put this from the bar beginning with a positional element, then we would have this lost, and it would, in a semantic sense, less strong. So I advocate for keeping at least this offset, and then you know what happens on this cursor point before the note. It just belongs to this note.
And we can simplify the offset by having it be in a level of ticks that has a fixed denominator instead of a fixed unit instead of a.
Couldn't disagree.
Doesn't.
Yeah, we
couldn't disagree with anything that you've all just said.
We're going to have
everything that you said.
We're going to have a big bake off on the list,
which we do not have time.
The chairs do not agree. Yeah, Alex, you have your hand up next.
The proposal as it stands now, does it allow to nest events and sequences into each other?
Well, in the very specific sense, a tuplet acts like a sequence.
That's what we my next point. You're doing it already with that. Because as I thought about it, wouldn't nesting just solve the whole cursor thing? Because you have your whole note.
Say more.
You have your event for your whole note. You put your whole note in there. And you put a sequence in there, in which you put two, maybe even just one event for the half note. Then you have advanced within your event for your whole note. You now have a position where you can put your text object or whatever. Now your sequence has run out. The whole thing goes back to your parent object, parent event, and you advance the cursor. And you can do that actually just as you say you can nest several sequences in a bar, in a measure, excuse me. You can nest several sequences in an event again to just position things there. And when they all have run out, you jump back to the parent event and you event forward.
Thanks.
Is this too simplistic?
I'm not sure. I really need to think about it more. I think we need to get this subject on the list and get some real concrete XML in front of people.
Yeah.
Yeah. It might work. I don't know. I need to think about it.
I have it in those 2 pages. We can maybe have a look later.
Yes.
If you want to see it in.
Mogans, did you?
Yes, it's a problem that we have several parts, and you have this dynamic in one part and not in the other part. Is this the problem here?
I don't think that's related. I'm not sure. Again.
Because there are some symbols that often just exist in the first part.
That's the next page. I love you because you brought up the topic of what's on the next page. That'd be a good segue. Any other burning comments on this subject? Yeah.
Okay, quickly. I think that we could do this without a cursor. So
yeah,
the events should perhaps still be laid out in their sequential order. That's fine. But the things that are not events could be specified by position. However, the position does not have to be spatial. It could be temporal. So I could have a forte, and I could say this forte goes at, and then instead of using ticks, I would use the third quarter note. I would use some semantic.
Yeah. That's option 1 up here. That's what I meant by it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because no cursor.
Yeah, I'm with you, Matt. Johannes wants to say something quickly. Go ahead, Johannes.
That's exactly what MI offers. You can tie those we call them control events like dynamics, where you can either to specific nodes or rests, but you can also freely position them somewhere in the temporal space. So
Yeah.
you say it's happening at B2,
Yeah.
B2.5, and that doesn't have to be something there.
All right, I'm gonna hit next because my clock here is advancing. So system notations, I might skip through some of these things quickly. So the perhaps confusingly named system tag proposes a kind of a pseudo part where all the things that are common to all parts go. So that would be things like bar lines, tempo indications, form indications, things that you would want to be displayed, even if you're looking at a subset of parts, would go here. And the alternative to that might be tagging things whenever they occur in some part, which sort of pushes some of my hot buttons, like, well, then why are they in a part if they apply to all parts? But anyway, that's another idea that's sort of come up in MNX. I might just kind of riff through, what does my last topic slide? I want to leave time for next steps, so
Yeah.
I think I'm just going to move on, and we'll have a little time at the end, hopefully. Next steps, what are we trying to do? I want certainly to get a chance to get some recent input into the proposal, build a few more examples, and we're going to create a document that kind of states our roadmap of record, and I think we should have some time goals for that. Thank you. We'll create some kind of beachhead specs because we really need to start having a spec that, rather than this sort of narrative overview like we have right now. We need to begin some way of having a reference implementation so that we can actually try stuff out with MNX and not just talk about it. And we want to continue the open design discussion about graphics and time along with what we're doing at a more leisurely pace. So that's what we have in mind for what's next. This is still quite a ways from probably defining some of the kind of boundary type decisions that we need to make. But I think we still need to make more progress on sort of the core within the core before we're ready to do that. So thoughts on this as an agenda for post-meeting? I also want us to continue kind of getting into concrete threads about stuff. And I'm not sure what the co-chairs think about when we should move to GitHub issues. I'm sort of starting to feel that it would help. But so far we've held back.
More after the roadmap.
More after the roadmap? Yeah. So, not yet, but we'll discuss. Okay, do I have a little bit of time to get in graphics?
Yeah, that's what I meant. I was doing the time relative to the...
And I know we promised someone a chance to talk about foray encoding. So, I want to say a little bit about what this more general approach that might look like. This is just my view. It hasn't taken the form of a real proposal that we could look at, but I feel that it's possible to take a very abstract approach to looking at really arbitrary graphics and establishing some kind of mapping, and that's that left arrow, between paths within that graphics. I don't mean paths in the sense of lines, but regions that have a kind of time gradient that unfolds over the region. And in CMN, that region would be a rectangle, and time would progress from left to right across it. But you can take a far more general approach to that and say, well, we've got some graphics, and time perhaps has a non-linear arrow within it, or an arrow that speeds up and slows down, or multiple mappings between different parts of the notation. Can you imagine something like a part book, where all the parts were on one page and nothing's lined up with anything else, and you might have multiple arrows moving through that at the same time. So some notion of connecting graphics at its most abstract with time at its most abstract, and coupling that with audio resources like MP4, MIDI, MP3, you name it. And one thing I wanted to show here is I think we need to cope with the possibility that there are multiple valid performances of a piece that differ in how they interpret time. So I don't even think we can really count on a single uniform mapping between the geometry of a score and the time in the performance. I don't think it necessarily is going to be metronomic or shared by all performances. There's so much room for interpretation of any score, whether it's CMN or some one-off modern creation. And I really would like to take the most general approach possible. So that's my very crude thinking about it so far. And that does take us to an interesting idea, which is we can treat this very general form of a score as graphics plus time plus audio as something into which a CMN score could almost be compiled. This creates a kind of a very low-level representation of a score's performance that could be potentially rendered by some very simple programs that just render the graphics, can show a cursor over it, can play the audio, and can synchronize those two somehow. So just an idea I want to throw out. That maybe this idea circles back and has value for all the kind of semantics heavy CWMN stuff that we're doing. And if you do that, it would make sense to do something that Verovio does, and NodeFlight does it too, although you can't really see that, and mark up the generated graphics in a way that points back to the semantic document. So you have some traceability. You know, okay, this rendered thing came from this quarter note with this pitch. You can do a lot with that kind of information. I think that's an interesting idea. So those are my thoughts on graphics for the time being. I welcome thoughts from the community. Anybody? And I'm going to give, James, I'm going to give you a chance to talk now. Go ahead. Do you want to do the foray now, or do you have something to say about it?
I would like to do a concrete example with the foray example, which you showed in the other book. I would like to, can you put it on the screen?
Absolutely. Yeah, so James had some things
You may want to come up to the
yeah, he could use that one too.
Yeah, the one on the side.
I'm a bit nervous that something to do slowly.
Do you want to sit next to me so you can see the screen?
Can anybody read that? Can you read this? Up here it says, I can't read it.
Do you want to scroll around?
No, you.
Okay.
Yeah, it's hard to read.
There's the system object, and it contains, in the other example, it contains a list of the measures.
The highlighting is really hard to read.
Oh, that's great.
Well, don't highlight it.
Yes.
Yeah. The system element contains a single measure here, but it can actually contain all the measures of the score.
Yes.
So, but here we're talking about one which has tempo, beats per minute, 60 quarter notes, and a time signature of 3 quarter notes. So actually, this measure is 3 seconds long. It's just a simple calculation. It's 3,000 milliseconds. So that means that I can replace the tempo and the line and the time by information that this measure is 3,000 milliseconds. Going further down, can you scroll down to the next measure? All the measures in this score are 3,000 milliseconds. So they have to add up, all the events have to add up 3,000 milliseconds. So I can actually, instead of
Try measure 2. That's
Measure 2. Okay, so we take line 85, it says event value 4. That's a quarter. Well, I can, it's assumed in this representation that that's 1,000 milliseconds. It's a single second, it lasts a second in the metronomic interpretation. But I can quite easily just change that to 980. If I put an extra attribute on this event, I can actually say, well, this is a shorter one. Or I can put a new event in there, which is a grace note, for example, and just say, I now have a grace note, which is 50 milliseconds, and I take that away from the after one. So I'm not limited to making this bar add up in common Western music notation. I can just add elements as much as I like, without having to make them add up as symbols. I can put 5 quarter notes in there, but they don't all have the same length. So they add up to 3,000 milliseconds. Okay, go down to the tuplet. Here's a tuplet at line 122. Well, actually, I can put that tuplet inside the event. The tuplet is actually like a beam. And I don't actually need to put it outside, because I can calculate and I can say, well, this tuplet is 2/8. It lasts 1,000 milliseconds. So I can make sure that the events that are actually currently inside this tuplet are 1,000 milliseconds. But by adding an attribute to each event. But I don't have to make them all the same length. I can do what I like. And I can put the tuplet inside the event so that it's like a beam. That means that you can, I mean, if this is a metronomic, I'm talking about a metronomic performance of measures that are all 3,000 milliseconds. But if we have different recordings, then we know that the measures are all different lengths. So if I know how long the measures are in a particular recording, then I can actually make sure that the notes add up in milliseconds. And I don't have to think about adding them up in time or what they look like. It's useful to make them look the way they do in common Western music notation, because that's the way it's easier to read. But it's not necessary.
You're effectively converting it to MIDI. The same
No,
semantics as MIDI.
I'm just saying durations, milliseconds.
Yeah, but that's the same semantics.
Well, it would be easy to. I mean, using milliseconds makes it easy to connect to MIDI.
Yes,
that's what the MIDI.
You're throwing away the information in the higher level.
I'm throwing
converting it into a performance.
I'm doing what you all do when you convert tuplets. You all convert them and you ground them wherever they go. But I'm doing that already here. So when you read this file, you know how long the notes ought to be, but you don't actually have to do any calculation.
Yes, you do, because you have to. You'd have to do some sort of reverse engineering to work out that there should be a tuplet bracket.
No, the tuplet bracket is just an annotation like a beam. It doesn't have any effect at all.
Yes, it does. It's written in the music.
Yes, but the durations that are in the tuplet are already prescribed.
Yeah, but you're just talking about the sound. You're not talking about the appearance. The tuplet bracket.
I think this is for the more generalized notation as opposed to the
this is a more general
common
way. This is going beyond common Western music notation, but it allows me to put notes anywhere I like, and it allows me to change the meaning of the symbols. I'm not fixed. I'm not fixed to the metronomic interpretation with 1,000 milliseconds per quarter note. That means that I can use the information from external recordings in the note. a particular quarter note graphic won't change while its duration changes. Right?
James?
Can you make
We're at the
some description in the forum of this, because I can't follow how it can be aligned to the measures.
Yeah, I've made a unfortunately my demonstration score will only run in Chrome with a plugin, so most people can't actually okay, that's what I wanted to say. But just add that it is of course possible to have many parallel recordings of the same score in the same score in the MNX.
Thanks.
Okay. Want to keep me wrapping up?
Yeah, Michael, would you like to do
Sure.
that? You began, so come full circle.
Again, what was that?
The question, what you left out today is the score and container mechanism. Are you?
Is that a question to me?
No,
sorry, to Joe.
Yeah, do you have a question about it?
Yeah, please explain.
The score container mechanism, very quickly, is a way to incorporate a hierarchy of components of the score, each of which is kind of like a complete score in itself. And each chunk can have its own content type. We do expect, though, that applications supporting the core of MNX will probably not accept every content type. And they may even impose restrictions on whether they deal with these collections or not. But we don't have a good way in MusicXML today to deal with works that are collections. So it's intended to...
Yeah. We have the opus type, which nobody implements, right? So we still have to address this issue of how do we have collected works together. And the containers and scores are both to address the issue of collections of works as well as being able to do works of different content types within a collection.
So it is general in the sense that I have sequences like a songbook with different pieces and alternative scores like orchestral score and the parts, which I can render this and this like, so that I can print out the parts, and I have in the same document, in a different container, the whole orchestra score. Is it meant by this? Not sequential, not alternative.
I mean, we'll work it out over time, but it's not so much score versus parts as movements within a piece, within a if you have a collection of multi-movement symphonies, that is one publication, for instance, or for, in our case, method books with lots and lots of different exercises, ways to put together these collections of content in a way that somebody will actually implement instead of the failure that we had on MusicXML's attempt to do that.
We promised Alex we'd come back to him. Do you think we can give him a minute or two?
I think so. You're
I don't remember anything of that sort.
Okay, good.
Okay.
I have a question, but I don't.
Yeah, go ahead.
Since we are there, my first question, when I read that the first time, and it comes back to my first question. That was my first question today. So I read that, okay, we have selection type, movement, type, section, and my first question again was there, who decides that? Who decides those types? Because, again, when we go to 16 to 1900, I would be very surprised if you can get those types comprehensively and prescribe them.
Yeah, well, it's the same as the answer to the other question, which is people who work on specs make some tough decisions, and the group does their best to feed the process with everyone's best take on the answer, and there's no perfect answer.
Because always when I see that, and I hear such an answer, I'm not a coder, etc., etc., etc. I don't know. All the work that you guys do, I don't really do. with the whole interoperability and the whole let's keep it simple, as we said in our private email exchange, I always get the impression, okay, the reason we try to do that, or you try to do that, or you would like to do that, is to keep effort down, to not have it really branch out in every direction. But if we do that, if we have to have a list that prescribes, well, there is something like a movement, there is something like a section, there is something like a song, there is something like an example, there is something like a trio, doesn't that do exactly that? Doesn't that bring us into a situation where some group has to maintain and get consensus what is permissible and what is not, in really arbitrary, and doesn't that create awful lot of work?
No, don't think so.
Okay, I'll take that.
Okay.
I hate to have the last word be no.
So the last word be yes to the reception, sponsored again by Steinberg. Thanks very much, Daniel and company. Thanks everybody for their contributions to the very lively discussions we've had on MNX, the contributions for the MusicXML 3.1 and SMUCL 1.2 format. This is a really exciting time in the community as we get a new release of the different existing standards and then start work on a whole next generation of standards which can address a whole new set of use cases and be very exciting times ahead for all of us. And so the conversation continues and continues, and I think it's great to have these face-to-face meetings interspersed with the online communications. So thanks very much, everybody, and we will have refreshments. Conversation.